Yeah, and that also goes to the other aspect that we got into very deep yesterday, which is about this whole idea of independent contractors. And one question I asked Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez at the Q&A at the Observer session was, do we think that the status quo of what independent contractor status is for wrestlers today will evolve in the next 3 to 5 years? And the examples I gave was, you have Paul Levesque's idea that there's going to be global localization. He announces at the Business Partner Summit in 2018. I think it was reported briefly, and then I think a lot of people forgot about it. But basically the idea is that we have a worldwide network of different NXT territories.
Developmental territories all over the world.
Yeah, and there would be one in Latin America. There'd be, of course, one in the United States. There'd be one in probably England. There would be one
India,
in
South America.
Either India. There might be one in Saudi Arabia if they want to pay enough money. Whatever it is, they would have this network here. And I was saying, if you are a quote-unquote wrestler, and then you're told, I want you to go move to the Latin America territory, I want you to go move to the India territory, seems like a very hard stretch to say that you're still an independent contractor in that situation. Seems like that's very difficult for you to make that argument that, yeah, I'm just a guy, but my boss told me to go move to another country and live there and train people. That's a really big stretch. And so that's going to be one area that's going to make it tough. Two, the whole idea of what an independent contractor is under U.S. law might look very differently if you're being promoted and living and spending all your time in another country all the time. Mm-hmm. Number three, I think what would be a really curious example would be if Vince McMahon left the picture, would the legal risk to the company of being declassified as independent contractors be so high that at some point Michelle or George or their legal counsel is just going to say to them, look, you can avoid having to settle all the time. You can avoid having to argue about insurance if you adopt more like a UFC model, where you basically say, yeah, you do all work for us. Yeah, I can tell you what to do with your time. I can tell you where to be here. I can tell you what to dress. I can tell you this, but I will, in exchange, give you insurance. And hey, we can now negotiate a big risk pool. And then this way, we have a lot less concerns that we're going to get a big lawsuit. And we've seen cases in the past where, like, I think it was Tiger Ali Singh. He went to Puerto Rico to go work for IWA Puerto Rico, and they like wrestled in a wet ring and he got hurt. Mm-hmm. And then he tried to basically say, WWE, I got hurt when you sent me to Puerto Rico. And WWE wanted to just basically be like, no, you're an independent contractor, you're responsible for your own injury, that you weren't on our show. Mm-hmm. And there was kind of a give and take about, like, if they send contracted wrestlers to go work for other promoters and they get injured, who pays for that?
And there's already not even in past times in other countries, which are maybe WWE promotions, maybe not, but there's instances today of, like, is WWE going to pay for your surgery or not?
Yeah, and it's like, okay, if you get injured in the middle of WrestleMania, yeah, they'll probably pay for your surgery. What if you get injured in the dark match? Yeah, they'll probably pay for your surgery. What if you get injured backstage before the show? Well, they'll probably pay for it. Well, what if you get injured in the hotel the morning of a show because you're there working out? Well, that's a little fuzzier. What if you get injured on an off day, but you're working out because you're supposed to stay in shape a certain amount? Well, that gets even more gray. And then you get to the point, well, what if you're Randy Orton, you're taking out the trash and you break your shoulder? Will they pay for that, or will they not pay for that? And so that's a very different world.
What if you've been wrestling for years and years and your knees are just disintegrated? There's no more cartilage left. You need double knee replacement.
Yeah. What if you're a jobber who's been brought in to do a 205 taping, and suddenly you get injured on that 205 taping? Will WWE pay for that?
Or maybe you were already injured.
Maybe you're already injured and you suddenly realize, if I work a WWE show, this will happen. The last piece of this is, with the global localization effort, one of the biggest things they're doing is they're bringing in people from around the world who oftentimes, when you're trying to do international recruiting, you're not bringing in more and more wrestlers. Because a lot of these places aren't going to have a huge wrestling culture. Saudi Arabia, if you're going to go hire 5 guys out of Saudi Arabia, the chance that most of them have been professionally wrestling trained is very low. They're probably CrossFit athletes, they're probably bodybuilders, they're probably, maybe they're even Olympians or soccer athletes. They're just something famous there. But
so you think the more WWE signs people who are not necessarily people who have this lifelong ambition to be pro wrestlers, who are not so worried if they leave WWE, they're not so worried about continuing a pro wrestling career.
Yes, and so my whole idea was,
they're not worried about getting sort of blackballed.
Yeah, like if you're an American Ninja Warrior and you go into wrestling and you get tired of it or get hurt, you feel you're treated really poorly, and you then say, hey, I'm going to sue WWE because they treated me like I was an independent contractor. They made me pay for my cars, my hotel, my food, and my insurance. Mm-hmm. And they dropped me the moment I looked like I either wasn't going to live up to some expectations they created for me, or because I was too hurt to continue competing and they didn't give me time off like I wanted. That person sounds like they have great standing, and doesn't give a F about whether or not they are going to be blackballed from the wrestling industry. Because the reality is, they can go on the CrossFit circuit, they can go on the Comic-Con circuit and sign American Ninja Warrior autographs. They can just go and be a normal person, go get a job and do something else. That's fine too. And so I just think that WWE is also running the risk that if they continue to kind of keep this system where they pretend it's not independent contractor, but or it is independent contractor, but they treat them completely the opposite, that eventually you're going to get someone with standing. Because the biggest challenge to getting sued on this is the statute of limitations for Connecticut is really short, like 3 years. And I think it's even something like it's 3 years from the last incident of when it could even be 3 years from the date you signed your contract. That's the other part I'm never clear on. And so that means you can really have a very tight timetable where most of the reason the CTE lawsuits aren't going very far is either A, the injuries and the wrestling that was claimed happened before 2005, which is kind of the time that they made the declaration that this is when we're going to say WWE knew what CTE was, or the fact that the statute of limitations ran out on those wrestlers to even file. So I think the best aspect you're going to have is probably that it's going to be an NXT or a very, 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 very low level WWE person who doesn't want to do it anymore.
It's going to be a developmental wrestler who is probably
we saw that
not on the main roster.
Big Russ McCullough, Evan Singleton. We've seen developmental wrestlers who have been the ones who have pushed some of these lawsuits and actually tried to go for it.
Those are plaintiffs in the
They were plaintiffs, yeah. They've almost all been dismissed completely.
So I would think in the last 3-4 years, since 2014 or so, Triple H has started to hire a lot more independent wrestlers. It seems like they value independent wrestlers, and they value independent wrestling success a lot more than they did in the past. So you'd think their propensity to hire people who are from other aspects of sports or entertainment, is lower, but yet at the same time they're hiring more talent than ever.
I think that's the thing, is that we think of the Matt Riddles and the Keith Lees of the world, and we say, oh, WWE hires pro wrestlers. They hired Samoa Joe, they hired AJ Styles, they're going to hire the Bucks, or whatever they're going to think. But when you actually look at the training class and you look at the pictures of the 20 people going up there, you're like, oh, that's Simone Biles' boyfriend. He's an Olympian gymnast. He's not a pro wrestler. Oh, that's a former football star. Oh, that's an Olympic sprinter, and that's a college athlete, and that's a high-level jiu-jitsu competitor. But those aren't pro wrestlers. So, like, when they actually look at the class that they're bringing in, a lot of times they're not bringing in people who either had a lot of pro wrestling experience or they have none. There are always people that have a little bit of pro wrestling experience.
And as your point is, they do more global localization. If they really do set up performance centers around the world that don't have a large independent wrestling community around it already, that they're going to have to rely on a lot of athletes and entertainers who are not lifelong.
Yeah, I mean, they might get out of it because they're not Americans, and so you're already signing them to different contracts in different countries or something. And that's the other piece that I'm always curious about is I do think one of the values of setting up developmental territories in other countries is it's a heck of a lot easier for someone to get a visa to go to Canada or to go to Europe, oftentimes, than go to the United States. Mm-hmm. And so if you're recruiting heavily in the Middle East, I bet you anything it's going to be a lot easier, or Asia, it's a lot easier for you to get them into Europe and be able to train them there. Or same thing in South America, that you might be much easier to just get these guys and get them going, because there's all sorts of people that will get hung up for an extraordinary amount of time due to the bureaucracy of the American visa system. That WWE is not going to care. Now, one thing that you and I were looking at yesterday is that IRS independent contractor.
You want to go through the
checklist.
IRS 20-factor checklist.
I don't want to make a big deal about it. I just want to make the point that the way the checklist works is it basically says to be an independent contractor, you have to have control of your own time. And when WWE does things like puts a dress code for what you wear on a plane, that violates that, because why would what you wear on a plane impact an independent contractor you're working for? Do you care what your roofing contractor wore to drive to your house? No, you don't, because that's part of the relationship you have with that person. So you're paying them for a discrete service, and then it ends. And if you're always paying that same person, if your entire business relies on this network of people doing these things for you, and if in addition you say, hey, by the way, next week you can't go work for all these other people, and by the way, you have to be here at this time and work for me. And even if you want to work for somebody else, that's a contract violation. And that we say it may or may not be terminable yourself. So if you say, hey, I'm Neville, I don't want to work for you anymore, yet somehow you're stuck in your contract, or Rey Mysterio, or Daniel Bryan, or CM Punk, or AJ Lee, all people who have had to kind of go into legal action and discussions with WWE about what does it mean for me to be under contract with you. I think that's the other half of it that makes it really fuzzy, is that it does not do well on the IRS test. Now, Connecticut court is a little bit more liberal in favor of the businesses than kind of this government standard. In general, the government has just kind of stayed out of it and not wanted to deal with it. So it will be a question someday of whether or not there will be, like we talked about, would there be actual ability to create a union and actually negotiate? Because when the TV rights are going up as much as they are, and you look at the proportion of the wrestler pay, which is going to stay relatively flat, and maybe will inflate a little bit because there'll be people here, the Codys or the Young Bucks of the world, that are going to probably get a pretty sweet deal wherever they land.
And if independent wrestling doesn't sort of regenerate, then this could be kind of a one-time event or a one-time big blip that may not repeat over time if independent wrestling is really harvested like it might be. I don't know.
And I honestly do think that insurance will end up being the big reason that WWE just wants to kind of move away from this model at some point, is that they want to have a lot of control over where their athletes are going, why they're going to that network of people, and why that they're kind of covering those surgeries and understanding the recovery process for people. And in the same way that UFC eventually made that capitulation to do that, I think WWE will eventually get there, but I don't know if it will happen under Vince McMahon regime. So, we talk about George and Michelle. I think George and Michelle coming in from the outside, that would be day one. That's the right thing to do. However, Vince isn't going to give up on that. It's something he's fought for so many years. He's happy with the way it is. But it's kind of that pros and the cons about what a new leadership structure might look like for WWE. Mm-hmm. I still think that if Vince went away, there's even a possibility that it's not going to be Paul, it's not going to be Steph, it's not going to be George,
it's not going to be
Michelle.
A lot of people taking over his.
It could be a brand new outside the industry type person coming in. I'm thinking more like, it's a bad example, but like a Shonda Rhimes or the guy or Robert Kirkland or something, where you're talking about someone who has a creative vision of what it means to create a universe or create an idea, and this is a medium for them to do it in. Now, is that going to be the best person for it? Maybe, maybe not. But I think the challenge is that you cannot run pro wrestling like it's a business and just look at it as a balance sheet that you're managing the assets. I think you have to look at it as this is a creation model, and that we have a mission, just like a medical device company has a mission, just like a food company has a mission, and otherwise you're just an investment portfolio, and you just happen right now to produce a television show, and tomorrow, for all I know, you could be into GoBot reselling.
And in the case of secession, who would decide who becomes the CEO? Board of directors?
I would assume it's we actually know that there's a secession plan that has been written by the board of directors that has never been publicized.
We don't know what it is, no.
Yeah, because people have asked that question. People have bugged them about it.
Do other companies publicize their secession plans? Is that a normal thing?
I think if they think it's going to challenge their public perception of their stock, yes. But in this case, WWE doesn't.
They don't think so.
It doesn't appear that way.
Even though they list Vince McMahon as, McMahon leaving the company or whatever
as one of the big risks.
As a risk factor.
Yeah. So I think their answer is that we have this solution here, and we're not going to make a big deal about it, because then you could also create this infinite ripple effect too. Because if it said, hey, George Barrios is going to take over, the minute George Barrios leaves WWE, then suddenly it's created this ripple effect, and that was only a ripple because Vince leaves first. So it could be a little bizarre in that situation there.
All right, we're back on Wrestlenomics Radio. And we're going to talk about customs, right?
No, we're going to talk about
the business of custom.
An article by Mr. Jamie Sharp about independent contractor status. And it's a 3-part article, and I want to focus on part 2 here on the free show, because I think it's the most relevant portion of it for the vast majority of people listening. And I also hope it's something that if you're an independent wrestler, if you are a wrestler that maybe someday will even go to WWE, you'll think about what this story here says, and it will help you understand a little bit more of what it is. Because a lot of times people throw around terms like independent contractor, and then they come up with some really weird definitions of what makes someone an independent contractor or doesn't make them an independent contractor. And a lot of the times it's not about the things that people think it's about. Like, a lot of people think it has to do with competition. Like, how much time do you spend working for a competitor? And that's not really how it's defined legally to talk about what it is to be an independent contractor. And in fact, the article that Jamie Sharp wrote in 2005 is really interesting. And he starts off, the opening paragraph is pretty good. It just says, professional wrestlers are a unique breed of worker who have no real labor classification. While professional wrestling certainly requires a great deal of athleticism, professional wrestlers are not considered professional athletes because they do not compete in legitimate athletic competition. Similarly,
Although professional wrestlers participate in scripted storylines, they are generally not considered actors because they do not perform on a stage or on a movie set. Since professional wrestling uses elements of both professional sports and entertainment, perhaps the best way of classifying professional wrestlers is to follow Vince McMahon's lead and call them sports entertainers. And Jamie then goes through and talks about, how does it compare to other entertainment performers? And he talks about, most professional sports leagues have their own labor unions, and many actors enjoy the benefits of memberships in one of the several different actors unions. Most professional wrestlers, however, do not enjoy the benefit of any union, though he points out some of them have gotten, for instance, like a SAG card through their acting endeavors, and that's how they get some of those benefits. Mm-hmm. But what he'll go through here and what he explains is both the history about independent contractors and then the 10-factor test that is commonly used to kind of think about it. And it's about all of those factors being part of the decision about what makes you an independent contractor. There's no such thing as kind of a one test that says yes or no to it. And then the cases that have dealt with this in the past. So it's a really interesting piece. If you want to read the whole piece, you can search the 2005 article. Like I said, the name of the article is, I'm going to say it one more time here, Pinned Down, Labor Law and Professional Wrestling by Jamie Sharp. It was a 2005 entertainment and sports lawyer article. Jamie actually reached out to me and sent me a copy of the article. So that's, I had a copy of it to look at. My wife, I know, had looked at a copy of the article when she was doing research for her trademark law journal article. So I know it's out there. But if you want to see a lot of the notes on it, especially the notes that I took for this discussion here, you go to Wrestlenomics.com, you sign up, you're able to read the notes, you'll be able to read all the articles linked there, the notes that I'm taking here are linked there, and it's a very, very long article, and so I tried to kind of distill lots of parts of it down so that I could at least get the heart of some of the more interesting parts. But he does a really good job of walking through the history of professional wrestling, talking about the relationship between promoters and wrestlers throughout the last 100 years, going well back to Gawk, Hackenschmidt forward, talking about times that, wrestling has boomed and wrestling has bust, and just all the different relationships with the NWA and the times that the government has gotten involved in professional wrestling too. So it's a really interesting piece, and we'll talk about more of this on the paid show as well. But one of the things about what does it mean to be an independent contractor is there are certain benefits. So, Brandon, as an independent contractor, what are some of the benefits that you receive?
Benefits? I mean, like, as opposed to being an employee?
And when I say benefits, actually, what are the benefits to the promoter? There's 4 benefits to the promoter that he kind of calls out here. And the first one is that promoters get to avoid some taxes. So when you're an independent contractor, in theory, you pay the self-employment tax of 15%, whereas employees only pay half that because the other half is paid by the employer normally. You avoid workers' comp because if you're an independent contractor, you're not an employee to ask for workers' comp. And you avoid unemployment because you don't have to pay taxes on that and issues on that. And then the last one is that it's a great hurdle to stop organized labor movements. And specifically, when you look at the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, certain groups, such as independent contractors, are explicitly excluded from that agreement about creating these labor groups. So one of the reasons being an independent contractor is it is a real barrier to then having a union, and having the classification and the protections of that. So it's really interesting that over the years here, it has never really been well defined on whether or not professional wrestlers are or are not independent contractors. They're treated like independent contractors. WWE treats them like independent contractors. Part of that is just that no one has had the standing to challenge in recent years exactly what's going on. There's been 3 big cases that Jamie mentions, and I know there's been kind of 2 since then that I can think of. But the first one was 1953. Rubin versus American Sportsman Television Equity. You remember this one, right, Brandon?
No.
It was a labor organization that demanded that the plaintiffs agree to only use the wrestlers who were members of the labor organization in L.A. And the California Supreme Court finally determined the record is neither clear nor conclusive that wrestlers are employees and not independent contractors. And so it, quote, gives us little hope in determining whether a wrestler can be classified as an independent contractor. So that one's a bust. But it was an actual lawsuit over this exact subject in 1953. In 1969, the IRS did a ruling. And this is what sets Wrestlenomics apart. Because I think right now we are probably the only wrestling podcast talking about 1969 IRS rulings. Would you agree with that?
I would think so.
Yeah, I think so too. Wrestlers engaged in wrestling enterprise were not employees for the purposes of FICA, unemployment tax, or the collection of income taxes at the source on wages. And the IRS based its decision on the fact that the wrestling enterprise has no right to exercise direct or control over the details of the work performed by the wrestler, other than that sees that it does not break the rules of the State Athletic Commission. And the IRS noted that the wrestlers engage in the distinct occupation or a business of its own and is engaged only for a short period of time and is paid by the job. However, I think we would all agree that much has changed in the wrestling industry since 1969.
Yes.
And the whole idea of being a true freelancer going territory to territory has really evolved now that we're in the WWE world.
Yeah, like my impression is that it made sense in the territory days. It makes sense for independent wrestlers. But once you sign somebody to an exclusive contract, this is just my layman, impression of it, is like once you say, oh, you can't work here, you can only work here, then I think I sound like more like an employee and less like an independent contractor.
See, and this is where I think it's interesting, because I think you got to the right conclusion, but with the wrong premise. You went back to you can work here, you can't work there. And I'll tell you, when we go through these 10 tests here, you're never going to hear anything about not working for the competition. That is not an element of the 10-factor test to be an independent contractor. And in fact, what the article does a good job of doing is saying, here's what an independent wrestler can and can't do, and here's what a WWE wrestler, how that right is not the same for them. So I'll give you an example. Can you make your own merchandise as Brandon Howard Thurston?
Yes, and in fact, I do.
Can you license your likeness to people?
Yeah.
Are you in charge of taking care of your own licensing with the New York State Commission? If there was a commission where you had to be a licensed wrestler.
Yes.
Are you in charge of buying gear for yourself?
Yes.
Can you choose whether or not to wrestle on a weekend?
Yes.
Can you choose what moves to use in your match?
Mostly. Yep.
So there's some control, but for the most part. And so for most of these rules are good examples of what an independent contractor can do. And as we go through the test here, we'll see that there's some elements of that where as you become a WWE employee, it gets a lot fuzzier. But what was interesting is very little of this is about, I can't work for the competition. That's not the main focus of things. Even though that's how we tend to think about it so much. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that's not an element of it. But I was really struck when I went through this that is not the main driving point about what makes you or not makes you an independent contractor. And the third lawsuit, which before I got distracted here, was actually about John Tatum. It was a Mid-South Wrestling lawsuit where John Tatum was sued as part of a lawsuit over a car accident. And basically the plaintiff suggested that Tatum was an employee of Mid-South. And the court, in fact, did find that he was basically had a relationship of a principal and there was no factors that showed the relationship of a principal and independent contractor, and rather that he basically did have his work being dictated by Mid-South, so he worked for Mid-South. And the commentary on this was that Jamie Sharp at least wrote that he thought the guidance for the court's basis of determination was flawed because it was basically heavily reliant on one single factor, saying this is why he's an employee, when his point and the point of the article and the point of the IRS test is very much that it's this multiple level of things that you want to look at. And different states even have different numbers of these levels. Some states it's a 5-question thing. Some states it's a 20-question thing. But for the IRS type test, it's more of a 10-factor test. And what it's saying is that if you are, none of these factors necessarily outweigh the other factors, but when you put them all together, that's what should make your decision on. So there are these 10 factors, and probably would just make sense if I just kind of list off what they are, because we're going to go through them kind of one by one. And they sound a little abstract at times, so we'll actually try to make it clearer when we go through the 10. Are you in the notes? Do you see this section, Brandon? Where I'm saying this? I was going to give you a chance to read the 10 factors while I took a sip of water.
Okay. The 10-factor test. Number 1.
Yes.
The extent of control which, by the agreement, the master may exercise over the details of the work. The master. What does that mean?
We'll talk a little bit more about master-servant relationship here, but this comes up later.
Number 2. You want me to read all 10 right now?
Yes, please.
Number 2. Whether or not the one employed is engaged in a distinct occupation or business. Number 3. The kind of occupation in the locality the work is done under the direction of the employer or by a specialist without supervision. Number 4, the skill required in the particular occupation. Number 5, whether the employer or the workman supplies the instrumentalities, tools, and the place of work for the person doing the work. Number 6, the length of time for which the person is employed. Number 7, the method of a payment, whether by the time or by the job. Number 8, whether or not the work is part of the regular business of the employer. Number 9, whether or not the parties believe they are creating the relation of master and servant. Number 10, whether the principal is or is not in the business. So that's all 10. Master and servant.
All of these incidents of relationship must be assessed and weighed with no one factor being decisive. So when you read that list of 10, doesn't necessarily jump out to the layman exactly what that all means, right? It's a little convoluted.
No, I think the layman has no idea what this means.
But we'll do our best we can to kind of talk about what Jamie Sharp's interpretation is. And for the most part, I think his rationale is decent. And again, this is 2005 thinking. And I bring that up because there's a lot on here about, Vince McMahon is on his own and he's the only promotion that matters and nobody else, you can't make it in the U.S. unless you work for Vince, is like some of the narrative that he uses at one point. And I would say maybe, almost 15 years later, we are in a slightly different state. But a lot of it stays the same. And so when we think about WWE wrestlers, what he writes about is that there's kind of, in his mind, 4 kinds of wrestlers. There's Raw wrestlers, there's SmackDown wrestlers, there's injured wrestlers, and there's trainees. And again, this is kind of a funny 2005 way of putting it. He basically says Raw and SmackDown are the same thing. We don't have to think of those wrestlers differently. Then he says you have injured wrestlers. Those are wrestlers under contract to WWE, but they're not medically cleared to wrestle. And then you have wrestlers in training. And they'll come in really interestingly in one of these factors here, specifically around the skills factor of being an independent contractor. And then lastly, you have non-WWE contracted wrestlers, which for the purposes of what we're talking about, we'll call them independent wrestlers. Though in theory, you could say there's also the people that are contracted to other companies, right? Mm-hmm. There's both the Brandon Howards of the world, but there's also the people working for Ring of Honors. Mm-hmm. Important to remember that like all wrestlers in WWE generally have this same kind of structure to their contracts. And for the most part, I don't think this has changed that much in the last 15 years. One, if WWE books a show or an event, the wrestler has to show up if the promoter says so. Number 2, WWE gets the rights to the wrestler's likeness, including merchandising and licensing rights. Number 3, the wrestlers have a downside guarantee, meaning there's a certain amount of money that they're pretty much guaranteed to make, but they will probably make more if they somehow can exceed it. Number 4, the wrestlers are covered for medical expenses and physical therapy fees during the length of the contract, but this doesn't extend after the wrestler leaves the company. The policy towards injuries is that the wrestlers can even be terminated while injured, and the policy is somewhat discriminatory in the sense that it's not always that all injuries are covered, and the policy does not show regard always to whether the injury really occurred working for the company and in the ring, and it doesn't hold the company accountable for any wrestlers injured in the rings. And then the fact that the company does cover airfare for travel city to city, but generally ground transportation, hotels, meals, training, all that stuff, that's not covered. WWE wrestlers have to pay for that themselves. On the flip side, independent promotions, you get almost no coverage, right? There's no medical coverage there. They're pretty much just absorbing risk.
Yeah.
So in some ways, having a WWE contract is a little bit less risky than even being an independent wrestler.
I guess in New York State, which I think is, as far as I know, the only state that does this, there's a medical insurance requirement, which, supposedly you're able to make a claim against with a high deductible of like $1,000.
Interesting. Okay. So again, this is 2005. That sounds like a more modern version of what's happening in New York. And that is one element that they mention here a bunch of times.
I mean,
is
that
the fact that there are state athletic commissions that regulate wrestling, and that does put oftentimes the wrestlers in a position where they are required to comply with whatever the state commission is, and that is not WWE's responsibility as much as it is the individual wrestler's responsibility. My understanding, though, is WWE oftentimes helps the wrestlers comply with those obligations. Whether that's blood tests, whether that's, meeting a doctor before a show, whether it's whatever else, getting a license if it's a licensed state.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kind of go through these 10-factor tests. Number one, the degree of the control by the master as dictated by the contract. So the right of control of the manner of physical performance of the services as opposed to control over the results is generally the determinant of employee status. So basically, who gets to decide who you wrestle, when to wrestle, and how to finish the match?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
The promoter.
And in this case, WWE, right?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
And in fact, you can roll that all the way up and even say Vince McMahon to a degree, right? Because essentially it's Vince's show as the head of creative and as the head of the company. So he controls all of that. And in fact, if a wrestler were to say, I don't want to do that, they would probably expect their career to suffer.
Well, no, you're supposed to stand up to him. That's what he wants.
Yeah. And so the conclusion that Jamie came on this first one was the ability of the WWE to control each wrestler's character and storylines, as well as the ability to dictate when, where, and whom they wrestle, indicates that the wrestlers under contract to WWE should be classified as employees and not as independent contractors. So again, is there a degree of control by the master as dictated by the contract? And I'd say yes, because the contract basically says we tell you who to wrestle, we tell you who not to wrestle, essentially where you can't work, and we tell you, basically what it has to be. Who's going to win?
Yeah.
So the first factor seems like it pretty much goes pretty strongly towards the idea that, yes, you're an employee. Number two, whether or not employee is engaged in a distinct occupation or business. So this gets to this interesting question about, is the work considered an essential part of the business for whom the work is completed? If so, that indicates you're an employee. For years, the promoters have argued that the wrestlers are in fact just business for themselves.
But what is your promotion without wrestlers?
Well, and we get to that in another part here about what is the business of WWE.
They make movies.
What they would say is that when you're an independent wrestler, you get to control your merchandising and your likeness and your licensing. And on the flip side, in this case, WWE gets to control this.
Yeah.
So the disparity in the treatment between the two types of wrestlers, those that work for WWE and those that don't, but moreover, you could even argue that people that are treated differently, whether or not you're, quote, a team player or not, in theory, if you're all independent contractors, why would there be a team player?
Yeah. So what would that look like? Like not cooperating with somebody in the ring, or like not refusing to put somebody over or something like that?
I think that's what they were inferring, is basically the idea that the example given in the paper is Owen Hart not wanting to do a love angle and then instead being punished with the blue blazer gimmick. So the idea that you can get punished in wrestling if for some reason you've gone against what people consider to be, being a team player. And I think we could all think of examples that have been discreetly or indiscreetly put out there as examples that are supposed to humiliate people or degrade people or punish people because they're being uncooperative in some way. Yeah. From Piggy James to, the way that maybe a newbie might be treated in the Royal Rumble.
Well, that's just what you do when you're in charge of $1 billion frat house.
Yes. So the point here is that the wrestlers who are under contract with the WWE do not operate in their own distinct business. They work for WWE and their distinct business. And that's really true because you're giving your likeness and your merchandising and your rights to your character, essentially, to the development of your character to the company and letting them make that decision. You don't even get to decide how you're doing the business because they're booking the storyline for you in some way. And you can't decide, yeah, I'm not going to go to this town. I'm not going to go to this city. I'm not going to work with this person. Next one is the kind of occupation and whether the work is done without the direction of an employee or of a supervisor. So this is interesting because you can go back and forth on some of this where you can say, well, wrestlers under contract are under the direct supervision of WWE management. That is for sure. However, wrestlers are generally free to choose what moves they want to perform. And if you think of your work as being the match, you are given some leeway there. However, you could flip it around and say, what about all the times there's TV matches or there's pay-per-view matches? WWE pretty much tells you exactly how long you can go. You're not allowed to go tell whatever story you want. They have a very particular story they usually want you to tell. And it's not uncommon for them, in fact, to almost say, you know, take it on the road, rehearse it, and then by the time of the pay-per-view, you should have it down pat.
Yeah, and the impression I have of modern WWE is everybody's got a road agent, and I'm sure it varies depending on who it is, but there's a lot of control with road agents telling the wrestlers what to do and how to do the match.
Yeah, so if management orders a match to be performed in a certain way, the match must fall within the guidelines, or else the wrestler involved will fade with the prospect of being disciplined. Consequently, if this direct supervision indicates wrestlers under contract to WWE are much more akin to employees than they are to independent contractors. So for the number 2 and number 3, they both come very closer to being independent or to being employees. Because not only does WWE control your likeness, unlike an independent wrestler, but WWE also has the ability to tell you, you know, how basically for you to do the work. They're not leaving it open for you just to do whatever kind of match you want. And again, if you were to say, what's the difference between now and 1969? That's probably one of the biggest differences, right? Is in 1969, they probably booked the card, but they didn't really tell you all that much about what your match had to look like.
Yeah.
Number 4, the skill required for the particular occupation. Well, one of them would be evidence that the worker was skilled in handling his or her work was evidence that the worker was an independent contractor, not an employee. So basically the fact that you can be a wrestler and you can come in and you can say, this is my skill I'm bringing to the table, that makes you an independent contractor, right? The reason you would want to be hired by WWE, Brandon, is that you have the skill of wrestling. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes you right now, as a person who has that skill before you even enter the WWE, a good example of why you could be an independent contractor.
How is that different from employment, though? Like if
this isn't. That's the opposite.
If I'm a bus driver, I have the skill of bus driving, and then a bus driving company hires me. I'm still an employee.
Well, you probably become an employee because of all these other elements of the test. Again, not one factor here will make you an independent contractor or not. But the idea is you could also be a freelance bus driver. You could work for a tour company, and you could just drive high school bands when they go on their music trip once a year.
So a factor of being an employee is that the employer trains the worker.
That's oftentimes, and so that's what's the flip on this one.
Okay.
Is that you can say wrestlers are unique because the level of skill to perform is quite high, but WWE often hires people with no wrestling experience.
They do.
They target individuals with no experience in professional wrestling and trains them on the job.
They even have
that hurts their argument that you're an independent contractor.
Yeah, they even have a center where they teach people how to perform.
Yes, and that's another difference between 2005 and now. In 2005, the article here talks a lot about OVW and Randy Orton, Shelton Benjamin, and Brock Lesnar, whereas today we would talk much more about the NXT stars from a Chad Gable on up. Mm-hmm. But or Chad Gable might be a bad example because I think he did a tiny bit of wrestling before he joined.
Ronda Rousey.
Ronda Rousey or someone, yeah. Or a Casey, whatever her name is, the American Ninja Warrior woman. But the idea here being, now, the fact that WWE is willing and able to provide the training necessary for individuals with no experience, and that these individuals can obtain the requisite skill level needed to perform on WWE cards, illustrates the decreasing reliance on skill. Therefore, an individual does not need to be a skilled professional wrestler in order to obtain a WWE contract. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting argument there to basically say, could you be a pro wrestler 20 years ago if you didn't know how to pro wrestle?
someone would have to train you.
Exactly. And the idea being that you wouldn't just walk in and they'd be like, oh, you're good enough.
Yeah.
Here's a contract.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting argument here, but basically them saying that part of the fact that they have a training school goes to prove that this is not, that they're willing to not only train people, but they're willing to give people a contract to be a wrestler even before they know how to wrestle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really interesting point about it. It feels to me like it's much harder to even argue that an NXT talent is an independent contractor.
Yeah.
Maybe you could continue your argument that a WWE main roster talent is, because I don't know if there's been WWE main roster talent that does not know how to wrestle, short of maybe diva talent, like valets.
Celebrities.
Celebrities, maybe. But I think a celebrity would actually argue with some of the things that are going to come up here that celebrities and part-timers and whatnot actually fit in much better to the independent contractor status.
Announcers?
Most of the announcers that they're hiring come with the skills of being an announcer. So I would say a lot of them do seem like independent contractors to me until you start regulating when they have to be there.
Yeah. So Renee Young was working for some Canadian sports channel.
Yeah, she was working for like TSN beforehand.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that the skill required for the particular occupation, it's much easier to say you're an employee because they hire people that both know how to do the thing and are completely fresh off the boat.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of goes back to my whole feeling about the global localization model, where I think I kind of hit on this point unconsciously the other day when I was talking to Dave, where I was saying, doesn't the fact that we're trying to set up camps where more and more people are not coming from a wrestling background mean that we're getting closer and closer to treating them like employees? And I think this would actually bolster that argument.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number 4. Number 5, the employee, whether the employer or the workman, supplies the instrumentalities, tools, and the place of work for the person doing the work. So this is an interesting one because since the days of the NWA, you still had to bring your own ring gear. That was always something that wrestlers had to do.
Yeah, I would think forever. Like nobody's handing Frank Gotch a pair of wrestling trunks.
Yeah. So then you get, well, what does WWE do? Well, WWE gives you music videos. They give you pyrotechnics. They give you lighting effects. They give you an entrance. They give you music. They give you ring attire. They give you at least merchandising.
They don't give you ring attire.
They give you theme songs.
They give you ring attire?
Well, they give you merchandise, right? They've taken your license, and then when Daniel Bryan wears a Yes, Yes, Yes t-shirt that was made by WWE.
They give you a shirt that is merchandise that if you were on the indies, you'd be able to sell yourself and take all the profits for. But not so.
But you would also have to manufacture it yourself.
Yes.
So WWE in this case provides you that manufacturing.
Yes, and they take all the profit for you and give you a small royalty.
Yes, and WWE also does all the other things to help with your work. They give you location, sound, light, wrestling ring, officials, police, fire protection, state and local taxes, broadcast, mass media, licensing, merchandising agreements. Mm-hmm. Like when a wrestler runs a show, they don't have to pay the local taxes that day for the show. Now they have to pay it on their federal taxes and they have to pay it on their state taxes that they owe, but they don't have to deal with the day of commission, right?
Right.
And they do have a seamstress. And they do have makeup people there at TV.
Right.
So there is some element of your tools and your appearance that is being manipulated by WWE. However, I have heard that if WWE makes you gear, they will charge you for that gear. So if you use WWE's creator to make your ring gear, I've heard that they will charge you for that.
Great.
So, but I mean, that's part of the idea, because wrestlers still have to get their licenses to engage in wrestling matches. They have to maintain their physical condition and wrestling skills. Mm-hmm. They have to provide their own wardrobe, and they have to travel to and from shows.
Yeah.
So the conclusion that Jamie comes to is WWE provides its wrestlers with most of the tools necessary to work as a wrestler. But you could probably say that the gear piece of it is where it gets a little fuzzier.
And the travel, not including flights? The rental cars and the hotels.
Yes. And the fact that you are also responsible for instance, taking care of yourself and having some wrestling skill of your own. So the first 5 here have mostly been on this seems like an employee side. Number 6 is going to be a little different. Number 6 is the length of time for which a person is employed. The court found that if a person is only employed for a length of time needed to complete a specific job and has, quote, no continuing relationship is implied, thus indicating your relationship of an independent contractor. Which is to say, if someone comes to fix the roof of your house, they can't just stop fixing the roof of your house. They've made an agreement with you to do that. But the fact that they fix the roof of your house and they're done with the job, now your relationship is over. They've completed their contractual obligation.
Yeah, and WWE signs wrestlers to terminal contracts, 3-year deals, 5-year deals, or whatever.
Sort of. So they sign them to a contract and they're obligated to appear at the bookings for the promoter whenever they're booked for the length of the contract. So it appears to be a permanent situation. It's not that it's job by job. It's for a length of time. However, WWE only guarantees a limited number of bookings each year to the wrestler. Therefore, you could say that there's some sporadicism to the bookings. If you're Shawn Michaels, how many times a year are you working for WWE?
In this year?
Yeah.
Once.
Maybe a couple more than once.
Oh, okay. So he appears on Raw for an interview segment. Yeah.
Yeah, and he did like an NXT show not too long ago when he had the ab off with Johnny Gargano.
Yeah.
And occasionally he'll be on like a pre-show panel.
And he's a trainer at the Performance Center.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Let's put that aside. Let's put aside the trainer piece.
Yeah. Undertaker.
I'm just trying to Undertaker or something. You can make an argument that they're kind of sporadic in their contract, in their appearances. And in fact, when you are a wrestler, they don't ever really tell you, are you going to wrestle a lot or a little, right? Very few people have contracts like a Brock Lesnar, where they say, okay, you're going to wrestle this many times next year.
It's just assumed that you're going to work a full schedule, or they're just going to book you or not book you as much as they want.
Yes, and so that's where it gets really funny about this idea about being sporadic. And then the thing is, most wrestling contracts have this automatic renewal clause, which says the terms can automatically renew upon expiration unless they serve written notice to each other. So that increases the amount of permanence between the wrestler and the wrestling promoter. So that doesn't help the argument that you're an independent contractor. Because again, it's not only that would you have to keep fixing my roof, but I can keep renewing the amount of time you have to fix my roof. The flip of this, and what I'm giving you here is really the boiled down version of this. There's usually like 10 paragraphs to every one of these. So I'm trying to take out the pertinent information, and I'm realizing now in the distilled version it can be a little choppy. So I do hope people sit and read this piece. But one thing that's really interesting is they say, if you know a guy is going to leave you, say you're Cody Rhodes, and you're working for Ring of Honor, and you know your contract is up in January of 2019. Do you put the belt on him in December of 2018?
Probably not.
Why not?
Because I'm not going to have him much longer. Why invest in him? I want to invest in people who I know I'm going to have for a long-term commitment. Okay.
And then if you are New Japan Pro Wrestling and you have a contract with Okada, and that contract is good till the year 2025, do you make him your champion?
Yes.
And that's partially because wrestling companies have a long-standing policy of favoring wrestlers who have agreed to long-term contracts. Now, you could argue this Brock Lesnar deal could possibly be a good example of where they haven't done that. But it's reasonable to assume that wrestlers on a contract for an indefinite period of time are much more the employees than they are like independent contractors who only have sporadic relationships with the company. So he actually gives the example in here of like a Mick Foley, of someone who kind of came in, did a program with Randy Orton, left, went to TNA. He basically was an independent contractor. He was able to kind of say, hey, I would like to work with you guys. When he was done working with them, he left.
Chris Jericho the last couple of years.
And Chris Jericho now would probably be the example I would use. So I do think that you could make an argument that for the length of time piece, there is a much better argument that if it's not you're going to work for me for 3 years, but rather you're going to work for me for these matches, or you're going to come and do this program with me and then you leave, that is an independent contractor. Mm-hmm. However, like we're saying here, it's very difficult to promote a business around people that you don't necessarily have tied down. Now, in the old territory days, guys could leave all the time, right? They didn't really have a contract. They just more had an agreement of how long they were supposed to be in the territory. Yeah. And there's lots of stories of guys leaving territories either much earlier or much later than they wanted to.
Yeah, this is all verbal. I don't get the impression that there were any written contracts until, the mid-'80s or so?
I think for the most part. I think there's always been certain people who have been cut into promotions for different reasons. Oftentimes if they're owners or something.
Yeah.
As a way to kind of lock them down. So there have been times that people have basically said, hey, if you want to be a part owner of this, you also have to be a wrestler, and we're kind of making an agreement with you.
But the territory stories you hear are, oh yeah, Terry called me up and said, how much you making out down there? Oh, I'm making way more over here. Come out here. And then I gave notice the next day or something.
Yeah. So you could make a pretty good argument that in the old days, that is much closer to an independent contractor. Yeah. But when you're signing guys up for 3 years or 5 years or 5 years with a 2-year agreement, that doesn't sound like an independent contractor deal. Mm-hmm. Number 7. So this one is a yellow. He didn't say that this one was absolutely its employer, but for the most part, it doesn't sound very much like a independent contractor. It sounds much more like an employee. Number 7, the method of payment, whether by time or by the job. And this is another interesting one because this, you could also argue, has a lot to do with whether or not guys are working at their downside or in multiple of their downside. So if you're in NXT, you're probably receiving more likely your downside than you are if you're your average person in NXT. You're probably receiving your downside much more likely than you're receiving some extra amount of money that's on top of that.
You're saying the downside makes up the majority of your compensation?
Probably. Or that in the year, that's around what you're going to make, because you're not getting merchandise. Uh-huh. You may or may not actually be touring. You're not really finding other big venues that you're going to make a lot of money on. Versus if you're Roman Reigns, there's no way you're making your downside. You're making far more than that. Mm-hmm. And what's weird is say you're a guy like a Zack Ryder. Well, you're primarily paid based on your performance. And your performance is probably something having to do with the gate receipts and your merchandising and your licensing. But even then, it's not really based on your gate receipts, right? It's kind of based on where you are in the card. And even then, it's not really based on how many people are in the house where you are on the card. It's based on how do they feel like paying you that month for that tour.
It's someone's subjective judgment about how important are you to this show.
It's someone's judgment. Whether it's subjective or objective is unclear because it's opaque. So arbitrary might be the word we'd use. It appears arbitrary. We don't know whether it is because there's probably a system in place. Jim Ross has talked about on his podcast that, the mid-card guy would get about this for this tour and top guy would get this. But we have even less going on now with pay-per-view, right? Because that's less and less of a factor for it to be something that you can calculate off of.
But who's a mid-card guy and who's more or less is a judgment of...
Yeah. If the Bludgeon Brothers are today or a month ago were the SmackDown Tag Team Champions... Eric gets hurt, they drop the belts, and now Luke Harper is losing openers to Carl Anderson.
Or Ricochet on an NXT show.
Or Ricochet at the NXT show, where you could argue in Ricochet on the NXT show, he was certainly high mid-card, right? Where Luke Harper was a big deal for him to be like second from the top or third from the top on the show.
It was a North American title match, yeah.
Yeah, but on NXT, he was probably one of the bigger stars there.
Yeah, it wasn't advertised, but yes.
It wasn't, yeah. And so it just gets very arbitrary. And so one point that's also being made here is that this payment does get really funny because in the WCW days, you could argue almost all the guys in WCW were probably getting what they were told they were going to get paid because there was really high contracts. Because there was a lot of fighting going between WWF and WCW about getting guys locked down, so they gave them pretty high downsides. Versus today, the downsides aren't nearly as high, but the amount of money some guys are making is much, much higher. Mm-hmm. And so if you're on a salary, that's an employee. If you're on a performance-based system, that's much closer to being an independent contractor. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that there's so much variability for some of the wrestlers and not other wrestlers, again, I would go with the argument NXT people are almost definitely employees. Because they have a pretty steady paycheck. They have a pretty steady amount that they're going to make. Whereas WWE people are sometimes closer to being independent contractors because you have good years and bad years, good months and bad months. Mm-hmm. And because WWE compensates its wrestlers using both salaries and performance-based pay systems, whether it's a factor in the independent contractor analysis favors classifying them as independent contractors or employees is unresolved. Therefore, it's important to know the inherent flaws of the performance bonus system and the wrestlers under contract to WWE receiving salaries.
I mean, in a world where WWE converts everybody to be, all the wrestlers to being employees, how would they, deal with somebody moving up the card? So-and-so, they debuted and they're now they're in the main event. Braun Strowman, now he's in a main event spot. How would they move his pay without making him an independent contractor?
Well, you could objectify it. If you
make a pay scale.
If you headline a pay-per-view this month, you will be considered a main eventer. Mm-hmm. Main eventers are guaranteed to receive X percent of this. Mm-hmm. You could do it as when you renew their contract, you just say to them, hey, we're going to make you a main eventer next year. Therefore, your downside is now this.
And you still have downside guarantees as an employee.
Well, I mean, it might be called something different, but yeah, I think it's the same idea. Okay. Especially because there's royalties and licensing and merchandise, and those are not objective. I mean, those are objective. They're not subjective. It tells you how many shirts were sold and what percentage of that pool is yours.
Yeah.
What is subjective is what was the gate on the tour you were on, and what percentage of that gate are you entitled to, or what is the number of network subs, or what is the value of a Saudi Arabian $40 million Greatest Royal Rumble deal, mm-hmm. and how much of that should you receive? Mm-hmm. That's much more subjective. Mm-hmm. So this method of pay by time or the job, they don't really get paid by they kind of get paid by the job because you kind of get paid based on which tour you go on. And that's closer to being an independent contractor. But the reality is you are, for some people, just getting paid by the time because they have a downside guarantee, and so it's like getting a salary. Mm-hmm. So like I say, this is a mixed one. Number 6 and number 7 aren't so clear. Number 8, whether or not the work is part of the regular business of the employer. And this is what you were getting at earlier. What is the business of WWE? And so this was interesting because, again, this was 2005. So in 2005, he says, WWE calls itself an integrated media and entertainment company primarily engaged in development, production, and marketing of television programming, pay-per-view programming, and live events, and the licensing and the sale of the branded consumer products featuring our highly successful World Wrestling Entertainment brand. So this was like a 2005 or 2004 definition from their website. What areas of their brand, Brandon, do you think do not relate directly to professional wrestlers?
None of them.
Okay, what areas are not primarily professional wrestlers?
WWE
generally?
Studios.
So it's funny, he brings up WWE Films in this article from 2005.
Yeah.
And says that's a good example of something that isn't necessarily wrestling related. Is that the films division, while it does promote some of their wrestlers, is not straight up wrestling. Mm-hmm. And so that would be an argument that wrestlers are not the only business that WWE is. And then he goes into this argument that says, well, WWE has done stuff outside of wrestling. They did the World Bodybuilding Federation. They did the XFL. They did one of Sugar Ray Leonard's fights in 1998. They did, I think it was a Rolling Stones tour that they were promoting at one time.
The restaurant.
They did a restaurant, yeah. So you could say any one of those. However, those ventures failed. And not only that, they went away from those ventures. And I think this is where this might be where I would differ a little bit with Jamie, is that I would argue it is impossible to say WWE is just wrestling and there's nothing else. Because they now have a streaming network. They now have television contracts. They now are a brand that does so many things. And they have even side investments in the touts and the tap outs of the world. That they are more than just wrestling. However, I do think the primary business is wrestling. And that you could make a pretty good argument that without that primary business, one single, if you are if you're a company that makes widgets and then you also sell, I don't know, you also put on a fashion show once every 10 years, that doesn't make you a fashion company if that's 0.1% of your revenue.
Yeah.
And so I would argue that if wrestling is basically the product that they're selling, then they are a wrestling company. And therefore, if the work performed by the wrestlers under contract is part of the regular business of WWE, this work would indicate that these wrestlers are more akin to employees than independent contractors. So this is where you have to make that argument that this company is that. So, I would almost wonder what it would be like for, say, if there wasn't a division called World Championship Wrestling, but you just worked for Turner. Because there's no way you could argue Turner was WCW. WCW was a tiny part of Turner.
Yeah.
So it's interesting there. But you could say, because WWE bases its entire operation on the performance of the wrestlers, the work performed by these wrestlers is clearly integral to the regular business of WWE, indicates employee status. And the fact that WWE has failed in 3 separate endeavors to expand its business beyond the realm of promoting wrestlers further illustrates the notion that WWE is first and foremost a wrestling promotion.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was an interesting argument there. So, if the WWE network was completely successful and didn't just show wrestling on it,
yeah,
maybe you could make an argument it's something else.
But they do interview shows, but they have wrestlers on them.
And it also makes me just wonder about, again, this was written before the Chris Benoit tragedy.
Yeah.
But you could also make a pretty good argument to say, okay, one of your independent contractors did this thing, not in a wrestling ring. How did it affect your business?
Negatively?
And I would say it affected WWE a hell of a lot. And so the idea that the wrestlers are not integral to the business of WWE, to me, seems very much like the two must be interlinked.
Mm-hmm.
Number 9, we're almost done. Whether or not the parties believe they are creating the relationship of master and servant. And the comment section of the Restatement of Agency advises, it is not determinative that the parties believe or disbelieve that the relation of master or servant exists, except insofar such a belief indicates the assumption of control by one and the submission of control by the other. Therefore, in analyzing this factor, we look not only at the belief of the parties, but the assumption of control. So part of this would just get down to, do you think that wrestlers feel that the promotion is the master and that they are the servant?
Yes.
And they give an interesting analogy here about a cook and an employee. Because a cook has to prepare the food as directed by the employer. Mm-hmm. And you might even say, I don't like spice. Don't make this so spicy. And so you can even kind of advise them how to perform their job. And they give the example here of basically saying, well, it's kind of like a script you give to the wrestler where you're telling them what to do. And yes, you give them some control to exercise their skill, but ultimately they're preparing the thing that you're paying them for and that you're telling them what to do to make it.
Yeah.
Every wrestler under contract is aware of the control maintained by WWE in the relationship, and WWE controls the presentation, the direction of each character, and in some cases with little regard to the wrestlers who portray these characters. This was a footnote that he had, but I thought that was kind of an interesting little comment there, because I immediately thought of Daivari and his brother, who ended up playing, evil Iranians on the Saudi Arabia show.
Mm-hmm.
And just the fact that, sometimes they're given direction of their presentation here with little regard to the people that are portraying the characters. The sense that they're asking you to go play a stereotype or play something just because they believe that's the best use of you.
And they were, or at least one of them had a death threat.
Yeah. Evidence that wrestlers are aware of their servant status supports the argument that wrestlers under contract to WWE should be classified as employees, not as independent contractors. And then the last one is the 10th factor is to consider whether or not the principal is or is not in business. And it's very similar to the 8th factor, but it basically says in business is evidence that an employee-employee relationship exists. And previously discussed, WWE is clearly in the business of promoting wrestling events and marketing its wrestling promotion and characters. Without wrestlers to wrestle at these events, WWE would have no business to promote. So that's another question. If every wrestler stopped showing up on Monday would they have a show?
No. Unless they hired a new set of wrestlers. But
yeah, arguably they wouldn't really have a show.
No, yeah.
And so, and in fact, you could say, well, what if all the lighting directors didn't show up? Sure, but then could they do a show outside? Could they run a house show? Yeah, there's still options for them, but the wrestlers are the product that they create. So they mentioned probably the most uncertain factor is actually the payment factor, which might not jump out to people saying, hey, this is what an independent contractor does. But that ultimately was the one that was the vaguest, was about if your pay is going up and down based on kind of the gates and based on this, that suggests that you're working much more in a performance-based system that oftentimes is what an independent contractor relationship is. However, the fact that we can't quantify what those performances is coming from, that makes it tougher. Because independent contractors, hey, after the storm hits, maybe you get a bunch of business. You're not necessarily on a salary getting the same amount of money all the time. So wrestlers, when they sign, they're aware that WWE has control and they as wrestlers have to perform as told. And then the end of this second piece just kind of goes into this whole discussion about the inherent distrust. And the point he says is the inherent distrust among wrestlers makes it difficult to unionize because even when the wrestlers work together, everyone is aware that the lower card wrestlers want to wrestle in the main event and the main event wrestlers want to protect their main event status. This jealousy leads to division and it complicates any labor movement towards unionization.
There's an inherent competition in wrestling among wrestlers. So if you're Hulk Hogan and you hear that people are going to unionize, there's an incentive for you to blow them in because you're the top guy and you don't want I don't know. Does that make sense? I don't know if it does.
I think that's exactly what he's getting at. So that was section 2 of this interesting article. And again, if you go to Wrestlenomics.com, you sign up, you can see all the notes I wrote on this, you can read the article, and you can hear all the other shows that we've done on subjects just like this and other legal drama going on. So that's been an excellent discussion about this very in-depth subject. Brandon, was that as boring as I imagine it was for you, or was it interesting?
That was very interesting. It's a continuation of the conversation we were starting to have all week.
Yeah, and do you see what I mean when I say the focus is not on can you work for a competitor, but the focus is on so much more about you and the employee. Because even the whole idea of working for the competitor, that still make you an employee to somebody else.
I could have multiple jobs, I guess. I could work for my day job and then also work for somebody else as an employee. I could be an employee for multiple employers.
I think in this situation it would depend if they're controlling you. You know, again, it depends on these factors. How do they pay you? What's your relationship? Do you have the ability to kind of control who your character is? Can you merge it? One thing that would make you tough to be an employee is how can multiple people own your likeness and have the control over that likeness? Because ultimately you can't resell it to every person. All right, so this has been Wrestlenomics Radio. I'm your co-host, Christopher Mukigata Harrington. You can find me on Twitter at Mukigata. You can find us on Twitter at Wrestlenomics. You can email us at Wrestlenomics@gmail.com. You can find Brandon on Twitter at Brandon Thurston. And we will be doing a whole bunch more content for you over the next week and a half here, including stuff about the CMLL anniversary show. And we'll also be, of course, doing some more pretty cool stuff about the independent wrestler, independent employee, independent contractor article. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wanted to follow up a little bit about last week's article. So last week, I talked about the WWE Independent Contractor article, the series of 3 articles by Jamie Sharp. And we really went into depth in part 2, and I kind of glazed over part 1 and 3. And I thought part 1 had kind of some interesting parts to it that I thought you would have fun discussing, Brandon.
Okay.
It's about the history of the industry while looking at today's current landscape with one company dominating the business.
Are we going to talk about Frank Gotch today?
What's that?
Are we going to talk about Frank Gotch today?
Well, a little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit. So it talks about how in the beginning, you always have wrestlers inherently distrusting each other. Unfortunately, this industry is far from glamorous and has a checkered history regarding its labor relations. For decades, wrestlers have been manipulated by promoters, and this manipulation has led to them to suffer from unequal bargaining power and poor working conditions. By controlling the wrestlers, promoters have effectively squashed organizing movements by wrestlers and created a culture where the wrestlers inherently distrust each other. Agree or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, there's the stories of Hulk Hogan squashing the union that Jesse Ventura was trying to start. Right? There's a lot of competition among wrestlers. Yes.
Yeah. And then they talk about WCW and ECW folding, and just within a matter of months of 2001, you have two national companies going out of business and dozens or hundreds of performers being unemployed. And the people that were left, most wrestlers were happy simply to be working. Mm-hmm. And
some
I will say that
contract.
Is always going to be the challenge that you're going to have in professional wrestling is there's always that portion of people that are happy to have the job and makes them less likely to necessarily advocate for themselves as if it's a job similar to others in the marketplace.
Yeah. In the case of WCW, some of those wrestlers are still under contract for quite some time.
Not many, though. I think I think a lot of people have overestimated the number of people that were on those kind of contracts.
Okay.
A lot of those contracts had like certain number day out clauses. Mm-hmm. I think you only had a small group of people that had the super high value contracts, like the Stings and the Goldbergs of the world.
Okay.
Maybe Stevie Ray, maybe Nash and other people that were, able to kind of get buyouts on theirs. DDP did, but chose not to take it.
Right.
Rather came to WWF. Mm-hmm. It's all over the place. But I think that people have this vision that Frog or Lodi or someone was making bank when WCW closed. And I don't think that's true at all.
Frog? Who's Frog?
Frog was one of Lodi's friends who was a very obscure worldwide jobber.
Okay.
Who was supposed to wrestle Hayabusa during Hayabusa's one appearance for WCW before Hayabusa discovered he was not licensed to wrestle in the state of Virginia, and so he could not.
Hayabusa was going to wrestle in WCW.
Nice piece of trivia, huh?
Yeah.
It was Hayabusa was going to tag with the Great Muta, and Great Muta was working in WCW.
Oh, wow.
So Hayabusa came over to the U.S. to take some promo photos with him, and then at the same time was going to do a match for WCW.
Yeah, you do need a license to wrestle as a wrestler in Virginia. That is true.
So, the story holds up.
Mm-hmm.
One thing they also mention about, wrestlers is they just bring up the point that there's a lack of leverage for wrestlers because you can refuse to participate in a storyline or portray a certain character, but you lack that leverage in a negotiation and you risk upsetting Vince McMahon when you contest the ideas. If you alienate yourself to the company, you have a great chance that you won't be hired at all or used at all. The famous quotes in the most recent CTE lawsuit, all about how Vince McMahon hates lawyers.
Yes.
And doesn't want people bringing lawyers into the mix.
That's right.
So the article goes way back in time and just starts talking about why would you bother to fix wrestling? Why bother to create predetermination of the outcomes?
And that's relevant to this issue about contractors and employees?
Is this?
Is it relevant?
Yes, because I think the whole point is that they were trying to explain how did the industry end up in the place where it was. Why is it not like a sports, where you could argue, well, the people that win are the better athletes? Mm-hmm. Well, why did we get to a point when we had to treat them where we could control what they did?
Okay.
One of the big reasons that wrestlers act much more like employees than independent contractors is because the promoter has the ability to control even what happens at the end of their match.
Right. Okay.
And so you could argue if it was a fair competition, they would be a lot more like independent contractors because you wouldn't be able to control every aspect of their actual production.
Right. Okay.
So the question is then why do you fix wrestling? And so they were just saying, it allows the promoters to build the stars and you can better plan the future matches to draw better audiences. And, They talk a little bit about, how wrestlers kind of ended up being in two different groups. There was the performers who wanted to entertain the audience until the main event, and then the legitimate wrestlers who competed in the main event. And of course, so much of this was coming from the fear of the double cross. Mm-hmm. That you still needed your shooter in the main event, but you also wanted to have some other wrestlers that might be a little shinier in the earlier parts of the show.
Yeah. This is a big theme in Luthez's Hooker, his autobiography. That's basically a thing that he talks about a lot. That's why he had to be champion so often, is because they were worried about a double cross and they knew nobody could beat Luthez in a shoot. Legitimate competition.
They talk about how Gotch Hackenschmidt really ended up with a bunch of negative publicity because of all the controversy over it. And then shortly thereafter, pro wrestling has a huge economic down period.
So what is the negative publicity they're talking about related to Gotch Hackenschmidt?
Well, wasn't that with all the biting and kind of the double cross that was going on there.
I know there's something about in training, maybe someone was in Hackenschmidt was
paid to attack his knee too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and some of this started to get out of kind of just the feeling that that things were not on the up and up. And they were also making the point that promoters failed to replace Gotch after his retirement in 1914. And the fans grew bored with the slow scientific matches that were happening in the style of the day. Mm-hmm. And so what I really enjoyed about this piece here was not so much in the context of independent contractor, but in the context of how does a business have to reinvent itself over time? And they make the point that even by the 20s, they had to change the pace of the matches and put time limits in. They had to invent flashy moves and holds and get winning moves and finale moves. They had to present the wrestling card as a package rather than just individual wrestlers showing up.
The brand is the draw.
The brand is the draw. And they had to eliminate the athletic contests and shoots. And they were saying by 1920, virtually all matches were scripted. And yes, we know that there's been double crosses. We know that there's been the occasional shoot match. We know that there's been obviously the evolution of shoot fighting over time. But really, a lot of people think that they fail to recognize that for more than 100 years, professional wrestling has been worked.
Yeah.
And predetermined. Almost across the board. And so it's funny that when you'll see something like the Vox piece that kind of suggests that maybe Gorgeous George was the invention of flashy wrestlers. And be like, well, you're only off by maybe 40 years.
Mm-hmm. I guess Gorgeous George is one of the first famous gimmick wrestlers and is influential,
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's just the point that, there was always these things going on.
Yeah.
And he was, in a sense, kind of like Hogan of his era because he was the flashiest and he was drawing good TV ratings and people knew who he was. Mm-hmm. And it's just the idea that throughout history, that's the kind of stars that have, in fact, usually resonated with an audience.
The thing that's always blurry to me, and I wonder about a lot, is what was the audience's level of awareness? And when I think about, again, reading Luthez's book, there's a line in that I always remember where he says when he was a kid and he was going to wrestling matches with his dad, they kind of knew that that they weren't watching a legitimate shoot. They didn't talk about it as if it was a work, but I remember he says, we didn't feel like we were being swindled out of our money, though. So, I don't know. I think that's an underrated thing. And he talks
about that, Mr. Sharp talks about that in the article, talking about, some of the fans were things that the sports writers would write about wrestling going way back to the turn of the century. And it's clear that they also thought something might be up and would hint at it in many ways.
I think that's an underrated thing in wrestling.
It's a new thing.
I think that's an underrated thing in wrestling. Nobody talks about, I don't know, people like to say I remember when wrestling was real. If you talk to maybe one of your older family members and they talk about how they think wrestling was real or more real in some way in some previous era. I don't think people talk about that enough about what the perception of what wrestling was as far as how real or fake it was. And that's something that I kind of...
there's a couple other things. What about the Black Sox scandal of 1919?
Yeah.
People really, it created a huge uproar about legitimacy of professional sports. In 1934, there was a New York State Athletic Commission investigation into Rudy Miller, Jack Curley, Toots Monts, and Tom Pax, as well as Jimmy Londos and Dick Scheckett. And they were accused of fixing the outcomes of pro wrestling matches in 1934. Okay. And by that point, they had known it had been fixed for decades. Mm-hmm. So, the fact that undoubtedly, as he writes here in the piece, undoubtedly the deceptive practices of promoters created a stir among skeptical public about the legitimacy of matches. While members of the media had been aware that for years that the outcomes of wrestling matches were predetermined, the media had never divulged this information to the public. However, in 1929, a drunken press agent accidentally released all the next night's winners into the at a bar before it happened.
Accidentally at a bar?
Well, drunkenly at a bar.
Okay.
Yeah. So the whole point was that by 29, there was a lot of evidence that had already been out there. And it was more that there was challenges around things like the fact that promoters were clearly acting like a cartel. That was also kind of creating an interesting relationship. But what's funny is, so you have it go down, and then you have the business go back up again. And they mentioned, 1920s, the business actually did have a boom period, and then in the 1930s, it drops again. And why is that? Well, you have the 29 scandal, which is these results were leaked to the press. They had a NISAC investigation that never really came up with a very firm conclusion, but definitely brought ill repute to the business. And then you had the mass popularity of radio and the Great Depression. And they were saying that radio failed to capture the theatrics of a wrestling match, but was very, very popular. And I think that's a theme that you and I talk about a lot. As new media evolves and audiences are drawn to it, can professional wrestling adapt itself in such a way that it becomes a meaningful milestone in that, or does it go by the wayside?
Yeah, I guess so. The point is that radio often failed to capture the theatrics of a wrestling match, but not the economics. It always captured the economics of wrestling, didn't it? I think so. Wrestling was. I think pro wrestling ends up being a spectator sport because of the train and the automobile, doesn't it?
What do you mean by that?
Wrestlers were able to travel more. The top wrestlers, and I don't know how far back do trains go.
Well, to the 19th century.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay.
But yes, there's the element that that there was a lot more circuits, and then that also really helps that the NWA becomes a regional monopoly, and you basically can codify how the circuits are going to work, and at the same time become a monopoly or act like a monopoly, or at least an oligarchy, where you can control who can enter. You can basically create blacklists. And they talk about that's one of the reasons that they get investigated in the future is because of the blacklists that they start operating. Is that is, that's seen as something that then challenges the NWA. And that's why you eventually have the government investigation of the NWA. Even though they basically got sanctioned, but didn't really have to follow through with any big measures to change anything in the end. Still, the constant bickering between the promoters and a lack of leadership creates a situation doomed to fail. It's very hard to perpetuate a agreement among that many different people, especially when the leadership turns over. Mm-hmm. And in times of crisis. So then you get to the question of why did the McMahon succeed? And the 2 points that Sharp postulates in the article here is that basically Vince Sr. has MSG, and this is the industry's most important facility. And most of the nation's media was based in New York at that time, so they had unparalleled exposure in the nation's media capital. So that really helped Vince seem like he was the most important promoter at the time. Vince Sr. in this case.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you get to the next kind of media shift. You have the advent of cable television. And then when cable television comes along, suddenly all territories are competing with each other. And thus, when McMahon gets on the USA Network with 24 million viewers and takes, Joe Blanchard's promotion, the Southwest Championship Wrestling slot, that had shown a really bloody Tully Blanchard-Bob Sweet match, and they couldn't keep up with their $7,000 a week obligations, McMahon gets the USA slot, he buys the top stars, he invades local territories, he pays the networks to air his programming, and suddenly Vince McMahon Jr. has this completely different model than what the NWA is promoting. There's, Crockett buys the UWF, but when Crockett did that, he also absorbed all of Bill Watts' debt, which they point out was one of the biggest mistakes for Crockett, because he ended up having to make all those debt payments, and that really hurts him over the time, where he probably could have just let them go bankrupt and got the same talent.
Right.
You have Turner eventually buying Jim Crockett promotions, partially out of their fear that they're just going to lose all their television programming. That if they don't buy them, they're going to go under, and then if they don't have that TV programming, that's going to hurt them. Mm-hmm. So then they talk a lot about double crosses, and then eventually getting to like the competition on the wrestlers in the Monday Night War. And, they say basically wrestlers from promotions had tons of leverage when they were negotiating their contracts, because if they didn't like their contract or position with one company, the other company oftentimes would invite them in. And fearing that the opposition would greatly benefit from the addition wrestlers who became famous while working for another promotion, WCW and WWF started to sign guys to long-term guaranteed contracts, and salaries went up by a lot. And I think this is really important because that was one of the elements we were talking about before, is in the independent contractor versus employee relationship, whether you get paid basically the same amount all the time or whether you get paid kind of varying amounts based on the work you're doing plays a big role. And so there's been different phases and there's different classes of people where you have like the trainees in WWE. I would have to believe most NXT people get pretty much the same pay all the time because they're pretty much just going to get some of their downside guarantee, right?
Yeah.
Whereas most of the very top stars, the Roman Reigns or the Seth Rollins of the world, they're well above their downside guarantee. So if they get injured or if they're off television for a long period of time, they actually don't get anything short of like their merch money because they're well above their guarantee, and so they don't have to get paid anything else.
You think that people who appear on NXT TV, or even I would think we got to be paying people extra for takeovers.
They might be, but my point is that the majority. I'm not even talking about the NXT takeover people. I'm talking about the Chinese recruits.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about the 20 people on NXT takeover. I'm talking about the 80 people who have NXT contracts that just do the loop or other things.
So no extra pay for the floor loop.
Well, there might be a little pay, but again, if you might have to loop it up against whatever your downside guarantee is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just interesting because there is different models based on where you are in your ranking with the company and also over time. Whereas there was a period of time that WCW was signing some guys to some pretty lucrative contracts. I mean, you can go on my website, IndeedWrestling.com, and you can see all the documents that I've typed up with the help of a lot of people from the internet and with the help of David Bixenspan, help of all those WCW racial discrimination lawsuit documents where I've gone through and I've actually detailed every single person where I can say, Alex Wright, he had a contract that said he would make $375,000 salary in year one, $395,000 salary in year two, starting in 1999 to 2000. That's a pretty good downside for a guy like Alex Wright in the year 1999. And, you can even go to people like DDP. DDP had a $1.15 million salary in 1999. And it's pretty arguable that you would not be giving out contracts like that today because there's no competition to drive the numbers that high.
Mm-hmm.
So, eventually, though, WCW fails. Now, the reasons he listed was inept management, poor organization, outlandish expenditures, and boring storylines. I think that's part of it.
Yeah. I don't know if I would call it boring storylines, but just like nonsensical, counterproductive storylines.
And I would also, if I had to put another one in here, the poor organization, I might put a star next to, and also say poor relationships with parent company. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that the wedge between Turner and WCW grew over time, where Turner basically saw it as an expenditure they didn't need to keep eventually.
And isn't this something that you were telling me in Chicago, and I don't think we've talked about on air yet, is that you feel like you're reading somebody's book about WCW, and that like to run WCW was kind of a punishment.
It was at one point kind of listed as a punishment when somebody was kind of said, hey, I think we should get rid of this. Ted Turner's like, not only are we not getting rid of it, you're in charge of it now. To like kind of punish that person, it felt like. Mm-hmm. But I think there was always an inherent parent company rebellion against owning a wrestling company. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the biggest things that you could say that's one of WWE's greatest assets. Is that while people might say Vince McMahon is embarrassed to be a pro wrestling promoter or known as one, mm-hmm. he will never deny that is where his bread and butter is, and that is where that is where his roots are, and he's never going to make an action that is going to terminate his ability to be a professional wrestling organization.
Yeah, he's proud of the company.
He's proud of building this company. Yeah. Like he's never going to make a decision that it's more profitable to run a streaming service and he's going to go form Netflix too, and he's just going to get rid of the wrestling piece.
Yeah, I don't know if WBF had become this huge popular business, maybe he would have marginalized pro wrestling. I don't know. Or XFL for that matter. Who knows? I don't know.
That's an interesting question, and hopefully one that will be explored in that new Vince book.
Yeah.
That would be the question. That would be one of those questions I'd love to ask the authors, is to say, can you explain what you thought was going to happen if you became a movie studio executive?
Yeah.
Or if you got, if you were able to promote your stars as if they were The Rock rather than if they were Hulk Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
And then he lauds WWE's decision to acquire the contracts of younger performers who signed management-friendly contracts, which I think is his way of saying that they signed basically cheap contracts. And to a degree, that's true. You know, Chavo Guerrero, people like that, Raven, Buff Bagwell, you know, a lot of them came in not for high prices, but actually for very reasonable contracts. I would challenge that maybe WWE was very short-sighted in their pursuit of management-friendly contracts, and the value that they would have received by overpaying or paying the fair market value for a Goldberg, for a Flair, for a Sting immediately would have been the benefits would have far outweighed the initial costs.
Mm-hmm. And
that if WWE didn't have such a me first mentality where they felt the need to crush WCW, they would have, in fact, been able to prolong their ability and not really gone into a rut in 2002 and not really had almost a decade of kind of stagnation.
What do you mean by that? They wanted to crush WCW.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty well known how quickly they ran through the invasion storyline and the desire to demonstrate the superiority of WWE at almost every turn.
I see.
To humiliate.
You're talking about they didn't book WCW strongly. It was over and done with pretty quickly as far as bringing in the WCW talent as WCW talent.
Yeah, and again, Dave Meltzer's talked a lot about it, where originally the idea was for WCW to take over Monday Night Raw.
Right.
Because the feeling was that you can't have WCW as a secondary brand. You have to actually elevate them all the way to the top. Right. And then by the end, you know, you have, you know, Chris Kanyon just getting chokeslammed by The Undertaker. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of very questionable choices that basically showed short-sightedness in their
Meltzer
ability
tells the story
to
that, you know, the Booker T and Buff Bagwell match, first WCW match they had, you know, the fans turned on it, and then Vince gave up on it right away.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is when you look at the Buff Bagwell royalties lawsuit, it reveals all the contracts from that period that he had. And it's hilarious to see Buff Bagwell might be close to the shortest contract I've ever seen in WWE.
How long is it?
Where someone actually is given a contract and then given a termination notice.
Oh.
Maybe a month later,
okay.
2 months later. I'd have to go to my my archive, which you can also see at IndeedWrestling.com.
His mom called Jim Ross. You know,
supposedly, yes.
So my son can't come to work today.
Let's see here, Pro Wrestling Contracts page. So my Pro Wrestling Contracts page, where I've got maybe 40 or so different contracts up. And if I go to Buff Bagwell's contract, I can see his 2001 contract where he actually got it from WWF. That was sent to him on June 4th, 2001. And he is terminated from WWE on August 7th, 2001. So he made it almost 2 months. And technically it's a weird buyout contract, but yes. So, and then just at the end, this article was written in 2005. And so a little bit of this article to me is there is some areas of it where you could argue perhaps the business has evolved in the last 10 years. Because in 2005, he says, it is realistic to assume that the startup costs of a new wrestling organization to compete with WWE would approach $100 million, and that Vince McMahon has total control over the industry, thus everyone working within the industry is subject to his demands. Mm-hmm. Decade later, I feel like things are a little different, because I do think that someone like New Japan has been able to begin to penetrate the American marketplace without needing WWE. Because we live in a world of streaming media where if you have the right access on streaming and media, you do have the ability to play in another global landscape that previously you didn't.
Yeah. It depends on what you mean by compete, which is...
Yep. So I think you have the ability to play. I don't think they're competing yet, but I think they have the ability to play. Yeah. And I do think that if a Amazon or a ESPN Plus or any other major streaming service were to pick them up, they would instantly have a lot of ability to reach a lot of people.
I mean, about around the time that this article was published, Impact appeared on Spike.
Yes, and so he writes about Impact a little bit, just kind of saying, hey, this thing happened, and it kind of looked like it was going to fail. But hey, maybe this Dixie Carter woman can fund it for long enough to make it work. Mm-hmm. Little did he know what the next 10 years would bring.
Yes.
So, I also read a really good article from 2014, 2015 by David Cowley called Employees versus Independent Contractors in Professional Wrestling, How WWE is Taking a Folding Chair to the Basic Tenets of Employment Law.
Yeah, did you read the first paragraph
not a big fan
of this article?
Pardon me?
Did you read the first paragraph of this article?
You can.
World Wrestling Entertainment markets its professional wrestling product as an escape from the stresses of everyday life. Every week, over 12 million people tune into the longest-running weekly episodic U.S. television program to watch cartoonishly muscular men and voluptuous women duke it out in the squared circle as part of storylines that range from the implausible to the impossible. Only 26% of the viewing audience are children, so the vast majority of adult viewers are in on professional wrestling's worst-kept secret. None of it is real.
That's your favorite thing, right? That you have to start every article by explaining how wrestling's not real?
I just wanted to just bury my head in the sand.
Much in the way you start every movie review by saying, while the Titanic actually sank, Leonardo DiCaprio is an actor playing a role in the movie about the Titanic.
Yeah. So what were you about to bury this article?
No, I like it. I like it. Right. I was going to bury the title. I hate when you have to do is taking a folding chair.
A folding
to
chair.
The basic.
Yeah. Did you see? There's something I came across lately about as a title, a triple threat. It's about the CTE lawsuit because it involves McDivitt.
Yes.
They've turned it into a triple threat.
Yes. But the article that I talked about from 2005 looked at the 10-item test. There's that 20-factor test that the IRS has. And David Cowley's article does a really good job of very succinctly hitting all 20 of these things. So I want to very, very, very quickly go through these 20 things. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
They'll be very quick. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do it like this. You're going to read the section in green.
Okay.
You're going to read the title.
Is that why this is color-coded?
I'm going to respond to the title.
Okay. Ready?
Yep.
Instructions. When, where, and how.
So do wrestlers get instructions on when, where, and how? Yeah,
Yes.
WWE controls their in-ring personality, their gimmicks. They're required to show up to the event before the broadcast. They're required to do off-site interviews, vignettes. They're required to appear at promotional events. I believe this would mean they're more like employees. Next.
Training.
Well, independent contractor system would normally mean you get no training from your employer who's purchasing your services. However, WWE has their internal farm team. We're going to talk about this on the free show about how legitimate is their farm team, their farm system, in terms of developing new wrestlers. But the fact that WWE has bothered to create their own training school actually drives more towards the idea that they are an employee relationship than independent contractors.
So the creation of the Performance Center just enhances the argument that they are employees.
Yeah, not just the creation, the fact that they've completely brought it in-house.
Yeah.
Because previously you could at least say, I have an arm's length relationship with OVW.
Mm-hmm.
Now you own NXT.
Right.
There's no argument that there's an arm's length relationship.
Yeah. Integration.
Can the employer continue to run your business without the services provided by the worker in question? Well, while any wrestler is replaceable, the class of workers in aggregate, not one worker in isolation, shows that WWE's business in sports entertainment requires professional wrestlers. Now, this is where I'd say there's always that asterisk, right? Because if you were to start saying, well, no, what if WWE is not in the business of professional wrestling? WWE is in the business of streaming media, merchandise rights, and licensing. It's a little different, right? Mm-hmm. That they're more like a talent agency.
They're a global media company that puts smiles on people's faces. They make movies, in fact.
Yeah, they're in the smile export business.
Yeah.
So this is one where it depends on whether WWE would never concede this point because they would argue they're not a professional wrestling company. They are a global integrated media company.
That's right.
But most of us would say without wrestling, WWE doesn't really exist. And the argument used in Jamie Sharp's article is every time they've tried to do something outside of WWE, professional wrestling, they failed, whether it's the WBF, the XFL, etc., the Sugar Ray Leonard fight, so forth.
Trying again with XFL in a couple of years, but yes.
But that's the point, is that you could argue that the WWE Network has been a big success for them. And that is an excellent example of a pivot on their point. of actually what they're doing as a business.
But
and now that they get more TV
network
rights than they do than for their live events, that says a lot about how their business is changing. They are becoming a media company.
Yeah. But what kind of content is on the W Network? Movies? TV shows?
Legends House.
Yes.
The CFO calls every quarter.
No, they're not. Those are on corporate.
They're not.
Corporate.w.com.
Frustrating.
Yeah.
Moving on.
D. I'll start saying the letters. D. Services rendered personally.
Can wrestlers outsource or subcontract your work?
That means, like, can a WWE wrestler, work for somebody else, another wrestling company?
No. Can they send somebody in their stead?
Can I send somebody instead? Can Roman Reigns say, hey, I can't make it today. I've got a substitute coming in.
Yeah. Can he say, hey, I know you really wanted to see Kalisto, but I got this El Torito guy. He's fantastic. He's going to come instead.
No.
You cannot outsource or subcontract your work. The way an independent contractor, they can agree to do something and they can hire someone else to maybe do that work. Next one.
E. Hiring, supervising, and paying assistants.
Okay, this is one that doesn't matter as much for WWE, but wrestlers are not responsible for paying the other individuals who assist in the creation of the product, nor can they subcontract the work to complete the job. If you think about it, it's kind of interesting because it's to say that the wrestlers don't pay for the writers, but the writers then kind of make decisions on what the wrestlers do. And so again, it's much closer to an employee-employee relationship than it is to independent contractor, because these writers have influence on the wrestlers, and yet the wrestlers don't pay them.
This would be like if I was had a roofing company. I would be hiring workers for my roofing company, who then the owner of a house would contract me to put a new roof on your house.
Yes, rather than the owner of the house hiring the person who's going to select all your materials.
Now, a wrestler doesn't really have other employees, I guess, unless you got an agent or something.
Yeah, and even that they're still an agent for you. So, I mean, you're still your own services.
Okay.
And the agent doesn't help WWE create their desired product. The agent is working on your behalf.
Right. And in fact,
I guess the only example would be if wrestlers were to pay Pat Patterson themselves to come up with the finish for the Royal Rumble rather than WWE paying them.
Okay. And by the way, a lot of wrestlers do are incorporated.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Next.
F. Continuing relationship.
So, is it job to job or is it over long term? Well, we know that booking contracts are long term. They resemble the employer relationships. They're like an NFL team and its players, and those players are considered employees by the legal standard. If the work is reoccurring, though at irregular intervals, it's still a continuing relationship. So even a Legends contract, even somebody who's not there every week, that can still be considered a continuing relationship. So almost in this entire sense, it still sounds more like employee-employee rather than independent contractor. Next.
G. Set of hours worked. Is that supposed to be worked?
Yeah. Set hours work. Can you set how many hours they're going to work is what that means. So, wrestlers must appear at the designated location to any event no more than an hour before the designated time. That was in Raven's contract. Failing to adhere to WWE's schedule can result in the wrestler being fined, suspended, or terminated at the sole discretion. If you ever work with a contractor, you know how frustrating it can be where you're not sure when they're going to work or when they're not going to work. But that's part of it, is that you can't set their hours of when they're going to work necessarily. As long as the work is completed in the time frame that you've basically established.
So the issue here is W is telling you when to show up, and that makes this more of an employee situation.
Yeah, if just like your employer might say, I need you to be here 9 to 5, rather than I need you to get this work done.
I see.
Independent contractor is paid for the job. An employee is required to be there, and part of that agreement is the employer has the ability to control you through the threat of firing you, and that's why they're able to set hours.
Okay. H. Are you done?
Yep.
H. Full-time required.
Well, there's no wrestling off season. The schedule implicitly restricts wrestlers from seeking work elsewhere. And you're explicitly restricted from seeking gainful work from other by the terms of the contract, which have the non-compete clauses, provisions that require wrestlers to obtain WWE's permission and approval before participating in other permitted activities. So I think what they're going on here is, A, you probably could not hold a 40-hour-a-week job if you're a wrestler for WWE. and I'm not talking about being a wrestler somewhere else. I'm talking about you're an accountant or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then B, you can't go work for another company. You can't be working for New Japan and be part of WWE. Mm-hmm. So does this job require your full time? Yes. Being a WWE wrestler pretty much does require your full time. So this sounds much more like an employee-employer relationship.
But if they let you sit home for, they don't even call you to TV anymore. What if you're JTG is what I'm saying. Did they call JTG? That might be an example. Again, not one of these factors makes you a employee or an independent contractor. It's the preponderance of all of it. Okay.
So it doesn't mean you have to hit every one of these to do it.
Yes. That's why we're going through all these factors. Yeah.
But also the question would be, could you actually get a job there, or are you still at their beck and call? Like, just because you did have a period of time off, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not requiring you to be at their beck and call whenever they want. Go ahead.
Doing work on employers' premises.
Yes, wrestlers do the work in WWE leased venues. They must appear at these places per the terms of their contract. This is not that they're able to wrestle at home and send in the videotape.
Mm-hmm. Or they even might do work at...
You could maybe argue that occasionally when guys have been able to do like promo work before they've gone back on the road, that's more independent contractor related. But for the most part, wrestlers do their wrestling work on wrestling shows or at wrestling facilities.
Or even at the headquarters, maybe. Are you hearing me?
Yeah. What did you say?
At the headquarters, maybe, even.
Yeah, well, that's still employees' premises.
Exactly, yeah.
Absolutely.
J, order or sequence set.
Wrestlers must adhere to a set routine of WWE to avoid termination. While you can improvise in your matches, WWE controls the routines, the finishes, and the schedules. Not only that, WWE typically has time limits on the matches. And then especially if they're showing it for television or pay-per-view, they want to make sure they have control over exactly when you're going to finish your match. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty hard to say that you have the ability to control your order or sequence. It sounds like they very much control your order and sequence of how you do your job.
Yeah. I think WWE wrestlers should be allowed to go as long as they want. They have the WWE Network now.
It's preponderance. You could say that there's actually gradients of this. Like, it sounds like, in New Japan or something, you might have a lot more opportunity to make kind of decisions about your matches. Almost everyone who works for WWE seems to feel that it's very, very rigid.
Yeah. K, oral or written reports.
They mentioned this one is not really very applicable. In the case of professional wrestlers, WWE monitors their progress through observation instead of written reports. You are required to do random drug tests. This is really more, I think, that if you're required to send in reports every week on how something is going, you're essentially working much like an employee, not like a independent contractor.
This isn't like an evaluation.
I think it is, but it's basically trying to say if you're establishing a relationship between you and them to say basically, here's where I am, therefore I am on track, and trying to prove that, that's much more like what an employee has to do, rather than what an independent contractor has to do, which is basically finish the job.
L, payment by hour, week, month.
This is what we are talking about when it comes to how are you getting paid. Are you getting paid based on your downside guarantee, which is a lot more like being paid on a salary? Or are you getting paid based on the job or based on the crowd, based on the amount you could make week to week? Mm-hmm. This will lean towards employee classification for many wrestlers, but you are paid in a characteristic of both employees and independent contractors. I have both oral reports and payment by hour, week, month in yellow because neither of those really favor employee or independent contractor in my mind.
M, payment of business and or traveling expenses.
So we know that WWE pays for your airfare, but they don't pay for your other flights, hotels, or in between expenses beginning the tour at the end of the tour. Yeah. Very few other guys use flights extra. But, if you wanted to, in theory, you could. Both WWE and wrestlers incur heavy travel expenses, so it's hard to say which one of them is really taking the burden. So again, this is a mixed one. This one doesn't really favor either group necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Except for in the case of when they put NXT wrestlers on the road temporarily, they pay their expenses then.
Yeah, the more I read this, the harder time I have justifying how you can call NXT wrestlers independent contractors. I think there's a little bit of a gray area when it comes to main roster people, but NXT wrestlers to me, to a T, because they're getting trained, because they're getting paid the same amount all the time, because they're completely controlled in what they can do, because they can't have other jobs. Everything sounds to me like they're employees.
And that's now where almost everybody starts out.
That's what I feel.
N, furnishing of tools and materials.
Yeah, I wrote ferning, which I don't think is a word, is it?
Oh, did I read that correctly? I didn't even see it. Okay.
No, you read the right word. I just wrote the word.
The autocorrect in my brain caught that. You're welcome.
They mentioned that this one's weird because the contract says costumes, wardrobes, props, makeups, all supposed to be provided by the wrestler. However, what about like the Bludgeon Brothers hammers? Do we really think the Bludgeon Brothers made those?
Probably not.
Or when they give you a belt?
Yeah.
That's WWE's belt, right? And if they destroy that belt, you don't have to replace it. WWE replaces it. Total Divas shows the women getting wardrobe and makeup. It's hard to say for sure who owns this piece of the puzzle, so we're going to leave it in the middle. This is another undecided one.
But the gear, we understand is, even if...
Gear would be a good example. So that's why I think this one is not clear-cut.
I've heard that,
gear does appear to be owned by the wrestlers
if,
and produced by the wrestlers.
WWE has its own seamstresses, but even if you get gear done by them, you have to pay for it. Did you tell me that, or did somebody else tell me that?
Yeah, no, I told you that, and that's what I've heard. Now, on the flip side, you could argue the fact they control your gimmick can also influence the gear. Mm-hmm. So if they say, hey, Paul Burchill, I want you to go be a pirate, now you have to go buy pirate gear. That's an interesting situation because they've kind of forced you into it.
They give you a drawing of what your character is going to be. Now you have to make gear for this character.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting kind of middle ground. That's why we say it's not clear cut. It looks to us like WWE is supplying some of the costume, wardrobes, props, and makeup necessary.
Oh, significant investment.
So the question is basically, do you have the ability to did the employee invest significant time and money to train you? If so, you're probably an employee. So if they made a significant investment in their developmental promotions and training centers to help you wrestlers perfect the craft, that suggests much more like you're an employee. I put this in the middle because you could make a strong argument there's a lot of people. The Samoa Joes of the world did not need to get trained by WWE to be a wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know whether I could say that this is true for all the main roster people. AJ Styles never worked in their training department. So,
but they'll take credit for that regardless.
But I mean, it's a good example. He would be someone that it'd be much harder to argue that you ever trained him. So therefore, he is much more like an independent contractor.
I don't know. I saw that Business Partner Summit where Paul Levesque talked about how great their talent development was and how they trained everybody, and they showed a picture of AJ Styles behind him.
I don't remember that. Did they really?
Yeah, that was a big to-do. We talked about that.
I don't remember AJ being called out on that.
I don't know if he was named, but there was a picture of like AJ Styles making his entrance as Triple H talked about how they were. I don't know. We'll find it. Okay.
I thought they were using. Yes, they did use him as an example of someone who was on the main roster. Yes, mm-hmm. I do recall that. Mm-hmm. We're almost there.
P, realization of profit or loss.
So the question is there a significant investment or a bona fide liability for expenses? So for instance, if you're fixing someone's roof and you go buy a bunch of lumber and that turns out to be lousy lumber and you have to go buy more lumber, you might actually cost yourself money, right? You have decisions about subcontracting the work, what materials to buy and so forth. However, wrestlers really don't have that kind of ability. They can't subcontract their work. They're not really taking on big investments that involve their materials in the same way that an independent contractor would. There's not a real risk of economic loss. Now, there's the abstraction of this where you could say, well, if you choose a bad gimmick or you have bad gear or you're not a very good wrestler, you don't keep yourself in shape, now you're realizing profit or loss. I don't really know how to reconcile all of that. However,
go ahead.
Compared to a independent contractor like a roofing contractor, this is way different.
Q, working for more than one firm at a time.
No, non-compete clauses make it clear this factor supports an employee classification.
R, making service available to the general public.
No, you cannot make your wrestling service available to anyone else besides WWE because you have a non-compete clause. In addition, they control your likeness and rights during the time that you're engaged to them.
Even though Velveteen Dream and Cassius Ohno have appeared on non-WWE shows. Sort of.
I'm guessing WWE shows. Controlled that appearance.
And The Undertaker appeared on whatever, JBL and All Japan, but they approved all of these moves.
Mm-hmm.
S, rights to discharge.
WWE reserves the right to end the agreement for any reason whatsoever, provided the wrestler gets 90 days notice.
Now George Barrios told us that these wrestlers can end their contracts anytime they choose.
Yeah. They mentioned the employee exercises control through the threat of dismissal, which causes the worker to obey your instructions. But independent contractors cannot be fired so long as they produce a result that meets the contract specifications. So basically, when you're an employer, you're at will. They can threaten to dismiss you. Independent contractors are much harder to fire because if they meet the contract obligation, you can't fire them. So it's much harder to argue how you're an independent contractor if you can be fired at will at any time. Especially if you want to leave the obligation and you can't.
Like Neville, right?
Like Neville, like Daniel Bryan, like Rey Mysterio, like CM Punk, like AJ Lee. Mm-hmm. Those are all people that we've heard of that have struggled with this. Not to mention any ones that we didn't hear about.
Yeah. T, right to terminate. Is that the same thing?
If wrestlers are independent contractors, they would be able to prematurely end the agreement. Instead, WWE can fire you with impunity and sue for damages if you walk away, but not vice versa.
What's the difference between S, right to discharge, and right to terminate?
The right to discharge is... What is the difference here?
They sound very similar.
I think one of them is basically whether or not you can be... you can end the agreement for any reason or whether it's just because you violated the contract specifications. And the other is the ability of either side just to quit the agreement at any time.
I don't want to be here anymore. I'm quitting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what the difference there is.
All right.
Is that one of them basically is when can you get rid of someone? And the other is when can either party just decide they want to walk away? So one of them is about you versus the other party. The other is internal. Mm-hmm. So that's the 20 test. Of the 20 tests, I'd say 15 of them are very favorable to the employee, and maybe 5 of them are in the middle that are more independent contractor or NA. Mm-hmm. And going back to Sharp's argument, the biggest piece of this is what is the preponderance? What is the majority of this? What is the factor as a whole look like? And in my mind, that's very heavily that you're looking much more at independent contractors. I can see an argument when you're talking about main roster people. I do not see an argument when you're talking about NXT talent personally.
So you think the risk here is one of these days there's going to be some non-indie wrestler person who gets hired by WWE, especially if they start hiring people from all over the world, who's going to have a short-term tenure with WWE and then is going to decide, hey, all this time that you had me classified as an independent contractor, I think I was really an employee. And they're going to sue WWE, and you think they have a chance at winning.
Well, and why does it matter? What's the difference between being the two? Well, one of them is that as an independent contractor, you're paying 15% tax, whereas the employer's not paying their half like they normally would.
And they didn't provide you with health insurance or any of that.
Yes, and so you're not getting health insurance, you're not getting a lot of things. So there's a lot of advantages WWE gets by leaving people in this kind of unequal bargaining power. Specifically, when you think about what's going to happen to guys after they retire. You know, you have all these people that don't have a pension plan. They don't have affordable health care that's available to them. They don't have a group health care rate that you could get if you put everybody together. You don't necessarily have family health care, you know, the ability to provide for other people in your family based on it. Mm-hmm. It's very tough. And so it's interesting to imagine that unionizing the wrestlers would maybe go one direction, but you could probably circumvent the need for a union if you just could come up with some of the solutions to these basic things.
Mm-hmm. And that's the whole story, right?
That's really a lot of the story. I recommend people read these articles. They're really good articles. They're really good things. Yes, some of them are very legally driven, but there's actually a lot of history behind them, and there's a lot of context. And I think it's interesting. One was written in 2005, one was written in 2014, and you're looking at so many of the same factors being evaluated, and you come up with pretty similar evaluation of both of them in my mind. So I learned a lot reading it. Like I said, I think oftentimes we overemphasize the non-compete clause, and we forget things like what's the element in which you get paid. How much of your time does it monopolize? things like that are much bigger factors in trying to determine how is someone an independent contractor. And this training element is something that I never understood before, and that's really shocking to me. I think NXT really, really puts a bow on it, where 10 years ago you could at least argue OVW is a little bit more long arm.
Yeah.
So really different world, because you got to get trained somewhere. It's not like, every independent contractor thinks everybody's got to learn their business somewhere. So that's one thing. But when you're literally getting trained by WWE because you've been signed to WWE to go work for WWE in the WWE style, and you're required to live with them, live in a place, do this, and they control basically the means, the who, what, where, when, how in every way, how are you not an employee?
Yeah.
And yeah, there could become a day where one of these kickboxers or Brazilian jiu-jitsu artists or acrobats or whoever it is they're hiring these days, Instagram model, where they just say, I don't want to do this anymore. And in addition, I'm very happy to go lend my name to a lawsuit and demonstrate that I was illegally classified as a independent contractor when in fact I was an employee.
You're thinking especially of somebody who works for WWE and then once they're done doesn't necessarily want to continue to be a pro wrestler. So they're not worried about like, ooh, am I going to alienate myself from WWE in the future? You think,
exactly.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see if it's something even as simple as they just someone who says, I want to get out. I want to go be an actor. And I don't think it's fair that WWE is holding me against my will.